Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, August 21st, 2023. And today I'm talking about legalized government robbery. And no, I'm not talking about taxation, at least this time. Instead, I want to talk about a federal civil asset forfeiture program called Equitable Sharing, what it is, how the states can nullify it into oblivion where it belongs, and also a pretty big strategic error that we've made in our own efforts to bring it to an end. But first of all, a quick overview of what civil asset forfeiture is before we get to the federal program, which actually empowers the states to do an end run around any state-level restriction on this process. Here from the Institute for Justice, which I think does some of the best work, if not the best work, on covering this issue. They say most states and the federal government have laws allowing police and prosecutors to seize and permanently keep Americans' cash, cars, homes, and other property suspected of being involved in a crime without regard to the owner's guilt or innocence. And that's really the key. They're taking the stuff if they believe. If you tell government that they have the power to do something, to take something, to confiscate something, as long as they suspect it was used in ways that they don't want it to be used, they're going to come up with all kinds of reasons to say that they suspect stuff. So this has gotten out of control. It clearly flips due process on its head. This is civil forfeiture, civil asset forfeiture, according to IJ, and it is rampant nationwide, with local, state, and federal agencies using it to collectively forfeit billions of dollars each year. Billions of dollars of stuff taken from people who are suspected of violating something and suspected of profiting from criminal activity. Mind you, we're not even addressing the root problem here in this discussion of, well, most of the criminal laws that we're talking about that people are forfeiting things in regards to really shouldn't exist in the first place, but that's another episode. They go on, many of these billions go directly to law enforcement, including the same police and prosecutors who seize and forfeit the property. So they've got an incentive, an encouragement to continue doing it and expanding it and to oppose any efforts to restrict it. So they're very aggressive in restricting this, just like they are very aggressive in any efforts to restrict the drug war or the war on your right to self-defense, your natural rights. Here again from IJ, civil forfeiture allows police to seize property on the mere suspicion that it is involved in criminal activity. Prosecutors can then forfeit or permanently keep the property without ever even charging the owner with a crime. And it goes even further. It gets to the point of absurdity. And they point out here that civil forfeiture is not only a civil process, and I apologize to any lawyers who love lawyers speak out there, and if I get this kind of screwed up, but I'm just going to read it the best I can. It is an in rem proceeding, meaning it is a lawsuit against the property and not the person. We've seen lawsuits titled like State of Texas versus a Chevy Silverado or a gold set of gold bars, things like that. Federal government, U.S. Department of Justice against 20 gold bars. Weird case names. Or they point out like Richardson versus $20,771 in U.S. currency and INRE U.S. currency, 31,000 2012 Volkswagen Jetta VIN number, blah, blah, blah. So they're basically charging the property. It's a lawsuit against the property, and I don't know if the property can ever prove its innocence. Anyways, owners can then lose their property even when innocent, and procedural protections common to criminal proceedings usually do not apply. It is legalized government armed robbery. It is extortion in many ways. And here from USA Today via State Line, they say 36 states, and because of this, there's a lot of people who are outraged about this, justly so, rightly so, across the political spectrum, surprisingly enough. And 36 states and the District of Columbia have taken steps to scale back their civil asset forfeiture laws since 2012. But only a small handful of them have really made a dent in it. Some of them have actually almost completely ended the practice in state law. But ultimately, if you look at the numbers of how much they're still collecting through civil asset forfeiture, they're still collecting a ton of money, and the amount keeps growing because in all the rest, it continues despite the restrictions. They can restrict it on a state level, and this is what we're getting into today, the federal equitable sharing civil asset forfeiture program, which is there to help states do, and of course they're telling us it's the way to take the tools away from the terrorists and the criminals who are out to hurt you, and government is going to protect us, and we know that those are very dangerous terms to use. If government is going to protect us, they're never really going to do it. They're going to use that power for something else. And so they restrict this on a state level, but still it continues because of a federal program. And that's what it says here at USA Today. In large part, civil asset forfeiture continues in the rest of the states because they have failed to close a giant loophole. The federal equitable sharing program, and it sounds so nice and friendly and equal and loving. Equitable sharing. Who doesn't like equality and sharing? Well, when it comes to federal, that's a bad choice. That program, they write, allows state and local law enforcement officials to partner with the U.S. Justice and Treasury Departments. Police agencies transfer seized property, money, or assets to the federal government and receive up to 80% of the proceeds of the loot, we'll call it, from the sale of the property, regardless of state law. So even when states restrict civil asset forfeiture, it continues almost unabated. In some situations, it tends to even get worse. And here back to Institute for Justice, they say by handing over seized property to the federal government, state and local law enforcement agencies can harness the litigation power of the federal government and circumvent state laws that provide better protection to property owners or direct forfeiture proceeds to a neutral account. So some states, and I'm going to get into an example, Missouri, of how in the state, I believe in the state constitution, they say if they're going to forfeit money, any money forfeited, it doesn't go to the law enforcement agency because that in and of itself is a perverse incentive. The agencies responsible for their own budget are going to, well, they pad their budget over time. And I've done some episodes on this. I wish I had one off the top of my head ready, covering how they use this for a budgetary line item is civil asset forfeiture. And so that means if they're not stealing enough people's stuff, they got to go out there and get more, or they have a shortfall and have to cut back. And then you've got all kinds of problems with unions. And you see how the cycle goes on. Anyways, IJ says each year, the federal government, so this is the equitable sharing program, which enables states to circumvent, or law enforcement to circumvent any restrictions in state law against their activity on civil asset forfeiture. The federal government pays out hundreds of millions of dollars every year to state and local agencies participating in the equitable sharing program. $333.8 million in 2019 alone. That's the latest stat we have from their report. More than $8.8 billion total from 2000 to 2019. So if we're talking about unconstitutional federal grant programs being a problem, how with money always comes strings attached. If you think about the Department of Education, for example, the federal government is sending loot to the states that they've stolen from the people in the states, and they're sending to them, and it comes with directives, suggestions maybe. And if people don't follow enough of those suggestions or directions or requirements, then they don't get the money. And then the system falls apart. And so we've got a very perverse incentive system, government fueling its own growth. Several states, IJ points out, including New Mexico, have shrunk the equitable sharing loophole in various ways. But in most states, it remains wide open. And I want to show you how this plays out in practice. Again, from Institute for Justice, they do a great report on this. I'll link to it in the show notes. I'll mention that in just a moment. But here's how they put it. Missouri they rate all 50 states. So if you want to know what's going on with civil asset forfeiture in your state, you're going to get a lot of detail by going to this report. Missouri earns a B+ for its forfeiture laws, largely because the state constitution directs forfeiture proceeds to schools, not law enforcement. I still think that's a perverse incentive because it's government fueling its own expansion, its own power. But it's not at least the people stealing the money directly on front line actually getting the proceeds. But even this, which was supposed to restrict or kind of cut back on the policing for profit motive is what a lot of people call it, hasn't worked because of the federal program. A 2019 investigation, they write, found that less than 2% of forfeited funds make it to Missouri schools. thanks at least in part to the equitable sharing loophole. So thank you, federal government, for even screwing this up. This even very modest, less bad version in Missouri is going bad. Now, mind you, it's the people on the ground still forfeiting and looking for that loophole who are a huge problem as well. And we have to actually accept that reality too. So the state constitution says if they forfeit money, if there's asset forfeiture happening, it has to go to schools. It has to go to schools, not law enforcement, but less than 2% of it still goes there. And that's why. Indeed, a state audit of Missouri's 2019 seizures found state and local law enforcement agencies transferred nearly half the value of their seizures to the federal government for forfeiture. So instead of doing forfeiture under state law, they do this process, which I'll explain in a moment, use the federal program. They become partners with the federal government. And because of that, funds the agencies receive back through equitable sharing from the feds do not go to the schools. In fact, they must stay with law enforcement and be used for law enforcement purposes. So the federal government partners with the states. The states do the on-the-ground grunt work for the feds. They say this is a federal issue. The feds collect the loot, and they send back 80% to the localities. And then do you think that the local law enforcement agencies are going to say no when the federal government says, no, we want you to do some federal gun control? If you wonder why in Missouri there was such aggressive opposition by law enforcement organizations, sheriff's organizations against the Second Amendment Preservation Act before and after passage, so aggressively against it. Now, of course, there are some outliers. There are some that are totally on board. They're on the right side when they're in law enforcement. But a vast majority of the opposition to protecting the Second Amendment from federal interference, banning the state from helping the feds enforce federal gun control, comes from law enforcement. And a big part of that, I would suspect, is because they get paid to help the feds, and they get tons and tons of money. So that's a little bit of how it plays out. Now, I did an episode a little over a year ago talking about the origins of the federal equitable sharing program. And I just want to mention this. Criminal, the federal equitable sharing asset forfeiture program is the name of the episode. And this is what I think is kind of fun to point out. Here from the overview. In 1984, a certain senator from Delaware, who now lives in the White House, helped create the federal civil asset forfeiture program known as equitable sharing. So the dude who's in Washington, D.C. now is really bad, but he's been bad for nearly 40 years. He's given us this program that's resulted in billions of dollars being stolen from the people and funding more government power. Now, states can easily nullify this program in practice and effect by just opting out of it. So Missouri restricts civil asset forfeiture pretty well under state law, and then in the state constitution addresses the financial incentive part of it as well. But because they don't have anything that restricts them from participating or playing along with the feds on the same thing, what they do, the law enforcement in Missouri does, is they just say, well, this is no longer a state issue. We're going to tell our friends at the ATF or the DEA that we've got a federal case. It's a similar law, and then they still get to get the money. So they do an end run around this. But states can actually nullify it in practice and effect. The feds can have the program, but if the states opt out, there's nothing that requires the states to participate in this. Now, we know financial incentives do a lot for these government clowns because, well, they're the bad guys. I mean, financial incentives in a normal market situation, that's a good thing. This is how you learn what the market wants. But this is obviously not a market response. This is very perverse. But states can just opt out and bring it to an end. A great example is New Mexico, which in 2015 restricted the state civil asset forfeiture program. I believe they ended it and replaced it with a criminal program. Basically, it says no forfeiture happens unless we can at least prove that you were guilty of a crime. Now, there can be some problems in that, but it's as far as the due process end, it's a huge improvement over what's been on the books. So in 2015, they restricted the program. They opted the state out of most of the federal asset forfeiture program. And you can see I've got this up here on the screen here, if you can read through all the numbers, but some highlights. Basically, starting in 2016, the amount of civil forfeiture dropped a lot in New Mexico. In 2016, it went down about 85%. From what it was previously, 2017, not from 2016, so 2017 from what it was previously, about 95%. 2018, about 85%, 2019, 67%. Some of the Treasury numbers, they're getting zero from the Department of Treasury when they were getting hundreds of thousands and overall millions year in and year out. So it's had a pretty significant impact. Literally all they did was say, we're no longer going to participate in this in most situations. Now, it's not all of it, and Institute for Justice points out in their recommendations for New Mexico, they need to fully close the civil asset forfeiture loophole. But if it's if it's an option of getting zero improvement or 33% improvement or 50 or 85 or 90, I'm always going to take the step forward and continue pushing. As Thomas Jefferson told us, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, because it takes time to convince people what's even for their own good. Now, I'm going to link to this Institute for Justice report, plus that other episode on Uncle Joe helping create the federal equitable sharing program, plus all the other articles and everything. Most of it's going to be Institute for Justice today. Over in the show notes, Alan Mosley is now helping me out with doing the blog posts over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. That'll be published in the next few hours after the live stream is done here today. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. Want to take a look over in the live chat and say hello to everyone here joining us live. I appreciate you here, whether you're here live in the archive, your first time, you've been here every single episode since day one. There's Sharon Patriot, Haji, Cowboy Roy Rogers, Larry Clark, John, Kirk Morrison, Frankie, and everyone else. I appreciate you guys watching the show or listening whenever you happen to do that. Thank you so much. Hope you had a great weekend. But let's get right back to it. So when you get down to it, opting out of the federal equitable sharing program is very, very straightforward. The state passes a law that says we're no longer going to do this. Then, as happened in New Mexico, you get some localities that fight it in court and blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, it's been working out very well. And they didn't even do the most awesome job that they could have done, but they've reduced the amount of asset forfeiture funds coming into the state to the government overall, in some situations, in some years, as high as 90% is what it has been before. And I would take one of the years was 67% reduction. I would take at any level of government, anywhere, anytime, a 67% reduction. If someone told me, if you do this, you're going to get 2/3 reduction in the amount of money that the government is taking from people in this issue, that should be a no-brainer almost every single time. So it's very straightforward, and it can be really, really effective. But there is a caveat. You have to know exactly what you're opting out of. And this is where we have screwed up pretty heavily, pretty big time in our work on civil asset forfeiture and primarily the equitable sharing program over the years. It turns out there's actually, and what we've learned in recent years, is it turns out that there's actually two parts of the federal equitable sharing program. Always the more layers that they add, the more stuff that they add, of course, it makes it more difficult. But we totally missed the boat on this. Let me just go over it briefly again. And here's from our forthcoming State of the Nullification Movement report being drafted by Mike Meharry right now. We're going through a review process and should have it published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report in the next few months. But here's how Mike puts it. Through a process known as adoption, the federal government can prosecute the forfeiture case under federal law, even though there was initially no federal involvement in the investigation and seizure. If the forfeiture is successful, the feds split the proceeds with the locals. Through this program, they can get up to 80% of the take. So, short version, the feds don't even have to start the case. It's called adoption. So, and this is what we focused on almost completely, is the adoption process. The local guys, they pull somebody over, they find a bunch of cash. Now, mind you, and I'm going to mention this again later in the show, there shouldn't be a crime. Someone shouldn't be a suspect just because they happen to have cash in their car. I mean, this might be another push towards cashless society control grid type of thing, but that's a side discussion. The idea that you're a suspect just for having loot in your car and the government wants to take it and then say, well, we think you're a drug dealer, you can't have this, and then they take it in your car, this is a real problem. But even if the locals do it and it's not a federal case, they can just say, oh, well, Controlled Substances Act, the federal law says all drugs are illegal all the time, so all certain ones, and we're going to contact our buddies in the DEA. Or maybe they find someone with a weapon in their car, and that tool of self-defense is not properly registered. And then they say, well, this is illegal under state law, but it's also illegal under federal law. So we'll call our buddies in the ATF. And then all of a sudden, through this adoption process, the federal government adopts the case as their own. So now it's a federal issue, a federal law, a federal case. And then the forfeiture goes through the federal forfeiture process, which has almost no restrictions ever. And the state and local law enforcement still do almost all the work. They're just literally working as tools, as grunt men for the federal government. And the fact is, they're still getting paid on the state's dime, but they're working for another agency, which is a double ripoff. So we focused on this adoption program because it seems pretty straightforward. And then we learn that's only a small part of the federal equitable sharing program. And Mike writes that state and local police can also tap into equitable sharing by working with the feds on joint task forces. I've covered them on this show a number of times. It's been too long, but basically in every single state, there are a bunch of federal state joint law enforcement task forces. There are some for the drug war. There are some for attacks on your right to keep and bear arms. The ATF has joint task forces in every major city and many of the smaller ones as well. And they have agreements, MOAs, memorandums of agreement, or MOUs, memorandums of understanding, saying that the states are going to partner with the feds. They're going to provide various agents and resources and stuff like that, and they work together. And when they work on those state federal task forces, they're deputized as federal agents. So they're no longer following state law. They're only paying attention to federal law. And we see this, again, on terrorism, on drugs, on guns, on all kinds of stuff. And that's the vast majority of where this equitable sharing money comes from. And Mike points out, and this is, I think the data comes from Institute for Justice as well, again, ij.org, about 70% of equitable sharing cases and 83% of the total value forfeited arise from these joint task forces. But a significant number also begin with adoption. So 30% of cases start with adoption. 70% come from the joint task forces. What we've done has been to focus entirely on adoption. And we have completely missed the boat on the fact that most equitable sharing forfeiture happens through joint task forces. And we heavily supported California, of all places, actually opting out of some of the federal equitable sharing program, but it was only on the adoption end. And we can see how that plays out. Now, it still has had some impact, but that means there's a much bigger, there's so much further that they have to go to actually completely get out of it than what happened in New Mexico, where we see massive drops of anywhere from 70 to 90% year over year in how much forfeiture is happening in the state. In California, the reductions are small, but the reductions still exist. So in 2016, they passed Senate Bill 443, which we backed and supported, opting out of the federal program. But when we were covering it, we thought that was the totality of it, that this adoption federal equitable sharing program was it. We didn't even pay attention to joint task forces. Thanks to IJ probably working directly with Meharry, that helped point out, hey, you guys are kind of missing the boat on this. And we have. And that's why we're trying to work to improve this and get better information and get better activism out and better legislation out to support these types of efforts. So the results, I've got this up on the screen here, but I will link to it in the show notes, or Alan is going to link to it in the show notes so you guys can read these numbers on your own time and you can look up your own state and see how things are. The results, they've gone from about $125 million a year that they're stealing through civil asset forfeiture on average to about $93 million. So we've got a 25% drop. I mean, as far as California goes, you wouldn't expect any drop in government theft. And that shows how powerful and straightforward that opting out of the federal program can actually be, how effective it can be. But missing the boat means instead of having a 90% drop, we're talking about 25%. So now, even in one situation, I needed to point out, I got in my notes here, in 2018, the number actually went up. And so that average number would be even lower. So they're finding all kinds of loopholes and openings to continue working with the feds, even though there are some strong restrictions on civil asset forfeiture in state statute here in California. So as long as those loopholes remain open, in any way, they're going to continue to be utilized and exploited in big ways. Now, here are some other states that have taken action on this. Again, from IJ. To date, no state, they write, has completely prohibited state and local law enforcement from participating in equitable sharing, but 9 states and D.C. have taken steps to shrink the loophole. So we've been reporting it that they've opted out of most of it, and we've been wrong. So we're taking it a little bit better look at how this is actually playing out in practice as we see the numbers come in recent years. 5 states, they write, Arizona, Maryland, Nebraska, New Mexico, and Ohio have prohibited state and local agencies from transferring property to the federal government for forfeiture unless the property is worth more than a threshold amount. So they're having it, in no situation can it be transferred to the feds unless it hits a certain threshold. They range from $25,000 in Nebraska to $100,000 in Ohio. And they say, for example, DOJ data indicates that between 2012 and 2016, that's the year that Nebraska passed its anti-circumvention law. I like how they put that. 93% of Nebraska's equitable sharing forfeitures fell below that threshold for equitable sharing participants. So they're basically saying in 93% of the situations, you cannot transfer it. We'd like it to see 100. Just because there's more money doesn't mean it's automatically more criminal and should be taken. And that's an important point that IJ makes as well. They say drastically reducing the profitability of equitable sharing is likely to reduce agencies' participation in the program, as we see happening in a big way in New Mexico, probably more than any other state. But while thresholds provide some protection, like in Nebraska and Ohio, they are, at the end of the day, arbitrary. Carrying large amounts of cash or driving an expensive car is not a crime. And of course, the government doesn't want anyone to be successful unless the government says it's okay. So that's a side note. And there's no good reason for police and prosecutors to treat properties on either side of an arbitrary threshold differently. And I think that's an important point. All property owners, the right to property is the foundation. Arthur Lee of Virginia so many years ago said it's the foundation of all of our other rights. And of course, you can kind of see how that connects. The right to keep and bear arms, the right to self-defense is, of course, part of the law of self-preservation, your right to own yourself. So all property owners are entitled to the same due process rights under the Constitution. And until the equitable sharing program is eliminated, those rights remain at risk. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. If you want to help us get this kind of information out to more people, absolutely nothing helps us get that work done every single day more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they keep trashing and devaluing, of course, it goes up and down, but they're really ruining the economy, and they have been for a long, long time. It's only going to keep getting worse until we can take a stand for liberty, whether the government wants us to or not. That's the long version of saying if you got $2 a month, throw it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'd be very grateful for any support you can consider giving us our way as well. While I've got another moment or so here, I want to take a look over in the live chat. Larry Clark says everything in government is a con gain. That reminds me of a great quote by Richard Henry Lee, who was writing to, I think, one of his nephews. And he basically said, this is the great anti-federalist Richard Henry Lee, who wanted to get a Bill of Rights attached to the proposed Constitution while still in the Confederation Congress, even before it was sent to the states, talked about how the whole point of a Bill of Rights was to point out that the federal government's powers were only those that were expressly delegated. So very original kind of 10th Amendment guy. And even though he was an anti-federalist, he served as one of the first senators from Virginia. The people there really, really believed in him. So anyways, it reminds me of this great quote. He said, "Politics is the science of fraud, and politicians are the professors of this science." So if we're going to follow the science, I think that's a good way to approach it. Good quote, good comment there, Larry. Kirk Morrison, we don't register guns in South Carolina. That's good. I mean, all guns should be undetectable to the government. Uncle Sham says Vermont ramped it up. And Haji points out how equitable sharing is a typically misleading name for this evil. Of course, if you think about things like Patriot Act, you're patriotic if you support constant violations of the Fourth Amendment at every level possible, all day, 24/7, 365. It's absolutely absurd. Joseph Bonamolo showed up A little late today, but of course, we've got the rewind. You can rewind, watch in the archive. Appreciate you stopping by and saying hello, even here at the end as well. I'll take a look. Oh, yeah. Uncle Joe's legacy is horrific on every level. I don't see who that is. The natural progression has occurred as Mencken foresaw. I love some H.L. Mencken quotes as well. Anyways, I'll take a look over in the chat a little bit later today, and also especially in the archive on rumble.com, odyssey.com. Great feedback that I get there, youtube.com. If you leave comments a little bit later on after the show is done broadcasting or live streaming, broadcasting. Man, I'm aging myself here. When it's done live streaming, especially on the mainstream platforms like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere, if you leave comments there, it'll help trigger the algorithm and tell them to show the program to more people, and it helps out a ton. So do reviews on Apple Podcasts, smashing the like button, subscribing, getting notifications. All those things do help us spread the word, and I'm very grateful for any help you can give us to getting the word out to more people. Again, I appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope your week is off to a great start, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.